I didn't cry when my mother told me she had given away my inheritance. I just stared at her across the kitchen table, waiting for the moment she would laugh and say it was some kind of cruel joke. But she didn't. Instead, she folded her hands like she was proud of herself and said, "I donated it to a children's charity. Your father would have wanted that." The strange part? My father had spent his entire life building that money for me. Not for strangers, not for publicity, for me. And somehow, overnight, my future had turned into a charity drama I never agreed to be part of. That was the moment my life quietly split into two timelines, before the inheritance dispute and after. My name is Claire, and until 2 years ago, I thought my family was normal. Not perfect, but stable. I grew up in a quiet town outside Portland. My father owned a small construction company. My mom stayed home most of the time, though she liked to describe herself as very involved in community work. What that really meant was charity committees, donation dinners, and long conversations about how important it was to give back. Growing up, I admired that about her. She always talked about kindness like it was the most important thing in the world. But kindness, I later learned, can look very different depending on who's paying for it. And in our case, it wasn't her, it was my father. My dad worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during busy seasons. He wasn't flashy, he didn't buy expensive cars, but he saved relentlessly. When I turned 23, he finally explained why. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, the smell of fresh-cut wood still on his jacket. He looked unusually serious. "Claire," he said, "I've been putting money away for you since the day you were born." I laughed at first. I thought he meant a small college fund. He shook his head. "No, I mean real money." Then he told me about the investment account he'd built over the years. Stocks, bonds, property shares, everything carefully managed with the help of a financial advisor. "It's yours someday," he said. "Your safety net, so you never have to stay somewhere that makes you miserable." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but that conversation stayed with me because it wasn't about money, it was about freedom, about knowing someone believed your future mattered, and my father did, more than anyone. 3 years later, he died suddenly from a heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. One phone call from the hospital, and my entire world collapsed. The months after his death were a blur of paperwork, grief, and quiet tension inside the house. My mom handled most of the financial details. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother. But something slowly started to feel off. Small things at first. She stopped talking about my father's savings. Whenever I asked about the investment account he told me about, she'd wave the question away. "It's complicated," she'd say. Or sometimes, "Your father didn't leave things very organized," which didn't make sense. My dad was the most organized person I'd ever known. Still, grief has a way of making you doubt your instincts, so I let it go for almost a year, until the afternoon I accidentally overheard her on the phone. She was in the living room speaking softly, but one sentence stopped me cold in the hallway. "Yes," she said, cheerfully. "The donation will be the largest our foundation has ever received." Donation. My stomach tightened. Then she said a number so large my brain refused to process it, because it was almost exactly the amount my father told me he'd saved for me. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. My mother hadn't just created a family conflict, she'd turned my father's life's work into a public charity drama, and she had done it without ever asking me. That night, I finally confronted her. I expected confusion, maybe even an apology. Instead, she calmly poured herself a glass of wine and said the words that would ignite the inheritance dispute that changed everything. "It was never really yours to begin with." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. It was never really yours to begin with. The words just hung there in the air between us, cold, casual, final. I stared at my mother across the kitchen island, trying to process what she had just said. This woman had raised me, packed my lunches, sat in the front row at every school play, and yet the tone in her voice that night felt strangely distant, almost rehearsed. "What do you mean?" I asked, quietly. She took a slow sip of wine before answering, like we were discussing something trivial. "Your father was very emotional about money. He always talked about that account like it was some sacred promise to you." I felt my chest tighten. "Because it was," I replied. She sighed the way people do when they think someone else is being unreasonable. "Claire, you're almost 30. You have a job, you're independent. Meanwhile, there are children out there with nothing." And just like that, the charity drama began unfolding in front of me. She spoke about it like it was noble, like she had done something heroic. But all I could hear was the echo of my father's voice telling me that money was meant to protect me, not strangers. "You gave it away?" My voice cracked slightly. She set her glass down and nodded. "Yes." The simplicity of that answer made the room spin. "How much?" I whispered. Her eyes flickered for a moment, like she was deciding how honest to be. "Most of it." My stomach dropped. That was the moment the inheritance dispute stopped being a suspicion and became terrifyingly real. The next few minutes felt surreal. I kept waiting for her to soften, to say she had only donated a small portion, but instead she launched into a passionate explanation about the foundation she had chosen. Apparently, she had been working with them for months. Charity meetings, fundraising dinners, public announcements, all organized without telling me. The more she talked, the more it felt like I had been written out of my own life story. "People are praising the donation," she continued. "They say it will fund 3 new youth programs." I blinked. "You already announced it?" "Yes," she said calmly. "The press release goes out next week." That was when something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about generosity. This was about reputation, public image, recognition. My mother had turned my father's life's work into a massive charity drama that would make her look like a philanthropist, and somehow I had become the villain for questioning it. "You didn't even ask me," I said slowly. Her expression hardened. "I didn't need to." The words landed like a slap. "That money was legally under your father's estate, and as his spouse, I had authority over it." Authority. Not responsibility. Not respect. Authority. In that moment, the family conflict deepened into something much darker, because this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision she had made long before I ever discovered it. "You knew he saved that money for me," I said. My voice was shaking now. She shrugged and said, "He said a lot of things." The casual dismissal of my father's intentions made my chest burn. "You're twisting this into some kind of inheritance dispute," she continued. "But honestly, Claire, I think you're just upset you didn't get a big payout." I stared at her in disbelief. Was that really what she thought of me? "That money wasn't about luxury," I said. "It was about what Dad wanted." She leaned back in her chair, clearly unimpressed. "Well," she said, "he's not here anymore." Silence filled the kitchen, and in that silence, I realized something chilling. My mother truly believed she had done the right thing, not just morally, but socially, which meant she had no intention of fixing it, no intention of reversing the donation, and no intention of acknowledging the family conflict she had just created. But the most unsettling part came a few seconds later, because that's when she said something that made my heart sink even further. "Oh, Claire, actually, there's something else you should know about the inheritance." I felt my stomach drop the moment she said that. "There's actually something else you should know about the inheritance." For a few seconds, I didn't speak. Some instinct deep inside me already knew whatever came next would make this inheritance dispute even worse. "What else?" I asked slowly. My mother didn't look nervous. If anything, she looked mildly irritated that I was still standing there questioning her. She picked up her wine glass again and took another slow sip. "Well," she said, "the donation hasn't technically been finalized yet." My heart jumped. "So it can be reversed." The words came out faster than I intended, but she shook her head almost immediately. "No, not really." Hope collapsed just as quickly as it appeared. "The foundation board already approved the transfer," she continued. "The announcement event is scheduled next month." Event. The word made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a quiet donation, it was a full-blown charity drama designed for an audience. Speeches, press photos, public praise. And suddenly I could see it clearly. My mother standing on a stage, smiling proudly while reporters wrote about her generosity, all funded by the money my father had saved for me. The family conflict suddenly felt bigger than just our house. It was about to become public. "What foundation?" I asked. She hesitated for half a second. Then she said the name, the Whitmore Youth Initiative. I recognized it immediately. They were fairly well known in our area. After-school programs, scholarships, community outreach. On the surface, it sounded like a good cause, and that almost made the situation worse, because if I pushed back, I would look selfish, ungrateful, like the villain in a story where my mother was the hero. The entire situation was turning into a carefully crafted charity drama. "Why that organization?" I asked. She shrugged. "I've been volunteering with them." "For how long?" "About a year." A year. That meant she started working with them only a few months after my father died, which meant something else, too. She had probably been planning this donation long before I overheard her on the phone. "You were going to tell me eventually, right?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Of course." But the answer didn't sound convincing. The truth was obvious now. If I hadn't overheard her on the phone, I might have found out from a newspaper article. The room felt suffocating. I walked to the sink just to have something to do with my hands. "So let me understand this," I said carefully. "Your dad spent 30 years building that account, and you decided to give most of it away without even talking to me." My mother sighed again. "Claire, please stop framing this like some ugly inheritance dispute." "Then what should I call it?" She spread her hands like the answer was obvious. "Generosity." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it, because generosity usually involves giving something that belongs to you, not something your husband spent decades saving for his daughter. "That money was meant for me," I said quietly. "You're assuming that," she replied. "No, he told me." Her expression tightened slightly for the first time. "Well," she said, "there's no legal document that says that." The sentence landed heavily, because suddenly the entire family conflict became about proof. Not intention, not love, proof. And proof was something my father might not have left behind. She must have seen the realization on my face, because she added one more sentence. "One more thing," she said. I turned toward her again. "What?" Her voice was calm, too calm. "The foundation board invited me to speak at the donation ceremony." My heart sank. "And they asked if you might want to attend too." I blinked in disbelief. "Attend?" She nodded. "They think it would be nice if the donor's daughter was there." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because suddenly the entire charity drama had a stage, and apparently I was expected to smile politely while watching my inheritance disappear. But what my mother didn't realize yet was that the inheritance dispute wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. For the rest of that night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing my father's voice from years earlier. "It's your safety net, Claire." The memory replayed over and over again, and with each repetition, the reality of the inheritance dispute felt more unbearable. Because this wasn't just money, it was the last promise my father ever made to me, and somehow my own mother had decided that promise didn't matter. The next morning, I started doing something I should have done months earlier. I began digging. At first, I told myself I was just trying to understand the situation better, but deep down, I was searching for proof. Proof that my father really had intended that money for me. Proof that this entire family conflict wasn't just my imagination. I started with old paperwork, boxes in the garage, folders in my father's office, tax documents, investment summaries, legal letters. For hours, I flipped through stacks of files that still smelled faintly like sawdust and coffee, the same smell that always followed my dad home from work. And eventually, I found something. Not a will, not exactly, but something close. It was an email printed out and tucked inside one of his financial folders. The message was from my father to his financial advisor. The subject line read, "Claire's Future Fund." My hands started shaking. I sat down in his old chair and read the message slowly. In it, my father clearly explained the purpose of the investment account. He wrote that the funds were meant to provide stability for me, that he wanted his daughter to always have options, to never feel trapped in a bad job, a bad relationship, or a bad life. It wasn't written like a legal instruction, but the intention was unmistakable. My chest tightened as I stared at the words, because now the inheritance dispute wasn't just emotional, it had evidence. That afternoon, I confronted my mother again. She was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, probably reading praise from people already excited about the donation. The charity drama was already gaining attention in the community. "You need to read this," I said. I handed her the printed email. She glanced at it briefly, then placed it on the coffee table without much interest. "That doesn't change anything," she said. I blinked. "What?" "It's not a legal document," she replied calmly. "He was just expressing a thought." A thought. 30 years of saving reduced to a thought. The casual way she dismissed it made my chest feel hollow. I told him about this account himself, and he told me it was for my future. Her expression tightened slightly for the first time. "Well," she said, "there's no legal document that says that." The sentence landed heavily, because suddenly the entire family conflict became about proof, not intention, not love, proof. And proof was something my father might not have left behind. She must have seen the realization on my face, because she added one more sentence. "One more thing," she said. I turned toward her again. "What?" Her voice was calm, too calm. "The foundation board invited me to speak at the donation ceremony." My heart sank. "And they asked if you might want to attend too." I blinked in disbelief. "Attend?" She nodded. "They think it would be nice if the donor's daughter was there." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because suddenly the entire charity drama had a stage, and apparently I was expected to smile politely while watching my inheritance disappear. But what my mother didn't realize yet was that the inheritance dispute wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. The reply from my father's financial advisor arrived at 8:12 the next morning. I remember the exact time because I had been staring at my phone for almost an hour already, refreshing my email every few minutes. When the message finally appeared, my hands started shaking. The advisor's name was Martin Keller. He had worked with my father for nearly 15 years. His email was short, but it changed everything. Claire, I was very surprised to hear about the donation you mentioned. Your father was very clear about the long-term structure of that investment account. There are details you may not be aware of. If possible, I recommend we speak in person. My heart started pounding. Details? What details? For the first time since the inheritance dispute began, a small spark of hope flickered inside me. Martin agreed to meet that afternoon at his office downtown. The entire drive there felt surreal. I kept replaying the conversation with my mother from the night before, the way she had dismissed my father's intentions so easily, the way she insisted the entire situation was simply a noble act of generosity. To her, the charity drama was already finished, but Martin's message suggested something very different. When I arrived, he greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "I'm very sorry about your father," he said. Then he gestured for me to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since his email arrived. "What did you mean by details?" Martin leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your father was extremely careful with his financial planning," he said. "That doesn't surprise me," I replied. He nodded. "That investment account you mentioned was indeed intended for you." Hearing someone else confirm it made my chest tighten. "So my mom shouldn't have been able to donate it." Martin hesitated. "The situation is complicated." Complicated. I was starting to hate that word. "As part of your father's estate, the account temporarily transferred under your mother's authority. However, the funds themselves are still tied to specific investment agreements." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means my entire balance can't simply be moved overnight." My pulse quickened. "You're saying the donation hasn't fully happened yet?" "Correct." A strange mix of relief and anger surged through me. So the inheritance dispute wasn't finished, not legally, not yet. Martin opened a folder on his desk and slid a document toward me. "These are the original investment contracts your father signed." I scanned the pages quickly. Financial terminology filled most of the document, but one section stood out: withdrawal restrictions. Several of the investments required advance liquidation periods, some as long as 6 months. I looked up. "So the money can't be transferred immediately." "Not the full amount," he said. "Only a portion is currently liquid." That meant something critical. The massive donation my mother was planning, the entire charity drama was fueling this inheritance dispute, wasn't actually complete yet. It was still in process, and processes could be interrupted. My mind started racing. "What happens if someone contests the transfer?" I asked. Martin studied me carefully. "Then the transaction could be paused until the matter is resolved." Paused. The word echoed in my mind, because suddenly the family conflict had shifted into a completely different territory, legal territory. "I'm not saying you should pursue that path," he added carefully, "but you deserve to know your options." For a long moment, I stared at the documents in front of me. My father's signature appeared at the bottom of several pages. Strong, confident, intentional. He had built this entire structure to protect my future, and now it was being turned into a public charity drama without my consent. When I finally looked up again, my voice was calm, much calmer than I felt. "Martin," I said, "if the donation ceremony is next month—" "Yes?" "Is it possible that the foundation doesn't realize the transfer isn't fully complete yet?" He nodded slowly. "That's very possible." A quiet idea began forming in my mind. Not revenge, not exactly. Something smarter, something patient. Because if my mother wanted this inheritance dispute to become a public story, then maybe the truth deserved an audience too. And for the first time since the family conflict began, I finally had a plan. For the next 2 weeks, I did something my mother never expected. Nothing. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. I stopped arguing. I stopped asking questions. Whenever she brought up the upcoming donation ceremony, I simply nodded politely. To her, it probably looked like the inheritance dispute had finally burned itself out, like I had accepted the situation. And that was exactly what I wanted her to believe, because the truth was, I had started working very quietly behind the scenes. The first thing I did was ask Martin for copies of every document related to the investment account: contracts, transfer requests, withdrawal schedules, everything. If this family conflict was going to escalate, I wanted to understand every detail of the financial structure my father had built. It turned out he had been even more careful than I realized. Nearly 70% of the account was locked inside long-term investment funds, funds that required multiple approvals before liquidation, and those approvals hadn't happened yet, which meant the massive donation my mother was planning, the entire charity drama was fueling this inheritance dispute, wasn't actually complete yet. It was still in process, and processes could be interrupted. My mind started racing. What happens if someone contests the transfer? I asked. Martin studied me carefully. Then the transaction could be paused until the matter is resolved. Paused. The word echoed in my mind, because suddenly the family conflict had shifted into a completely different territory, legal territory. I'm not saying you should pursue that path, he added carefully, but you deserve to know your options. For a long moment, I stared at the documents in front of me. My father's signature appeared at the bottom of several pages. Strong, confident, intentional. He had built this entire structure to protect my future, and now it was being turned into a public charity drama without my consent. When I finally looked up again, my voice was calm, much calmer than I felt. Martin, I said, if the donation ceremony is next month, yes? Is it possible that the foundation doesn't realize the transfer isn't fully complete yet? He nodded slowly. That's very possible. A quiet idea began forming in my mind. Not revenge, not exactly. Something smarter, something patient, because if my mother wanted this inheritance dispute to become a public story, then maybe the truth deserved an audience too. And for the first time since the family conflict began, I finally had a plan. For the next 2 weeks, I did something my mother never expected. Nothing. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. I stopped arguing. I stopped asking questions. Whenever she brought up the upcoming donation ceremony, I simply nodded politely. To her, it probably looked like the inheritance dispute had finally burned itself out, like I had accepted the situation. And that was exactly what I wanted her to believe. Because the truth was, I had started working very quietly behind the scenes. The first thing I did was ask Martin for copies of every document related to the investment account: contracts, transfer requests, withdrawal schedules, everything. If this family conflict was going to escalate, I wanted to understand every detail of the financial structure my father had built. It turned out he had been even more careful than I realized. Nearly 70% of the account was locked inside long-term investment funds, funds that required multiple approvals before liquidation, and those approvals hadn't happened yet, which meant the massive donation my mother was planning, the entire charity drama was fueling this inheritance dispute, wasn't actually complete yet. It was still in process, and processes could be interrupted. My mind started racing. What happens if someone contests the transfer? I asked. Martin studied me carefully. Then the transaction could be paused until the matter is resolved. Paused. The word echoed in my mind, because suddenly the family conflict had shifted into a completely different territory, legal territory. I'm not saying you should pursue that path, he added carefully, but you deserve to know your options. For a long moment, I stared at the documents in front of me. My father's signature appeared at the bottom of several pages. Strong, confident, intentional.
He had built this entire structure to protect my future, and now it was being turned into a public charity drama without my consent. When I finally looked up again, my voice was calm, much calmer than I felt. "Martin," I said, "if the donation ceremony is next month—" "Yes? Is it possible that the foundation doesn't realize the transfer isn't fully complete yet?" He nodded slowly. "That's very possible. A quiet idea."
The night of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. The Whitmore Youth Initiative had rented a large event hall downtown, the kind of place usually used for charity galas and corporate dinners. Soft music played as people mingled near the entrance. Waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks. Everything about the event was elegant, carefully staged, the perfect setting for the charity drama my mother had been preparing for weeks. And judging by the crowd, it was working. Local business owners, community leaders, even a few reporters, everyone seemed excited about the historic donation that was supposedly about to change the foundation's future. As I walked into the room, I spotted my mother almost immediately. She was standing near the stage, talking animatedly with two members of the foundation board. She looked radiant, confident, like someone about to receive an award. For a moment, I simply watched her from across the room. It was strange seeing the same woman who had dismissed my concerns about the inheritance dispute now basking in admiration. To everyone here, she was generous, selfless, a hero. No one knew about the family conflict behind the scenes, at least, not yet. When she finally noticed me, her face brightened. "Claire," she called. Several people turned toward me as she waved me over. "This is my daughter," she told the board members proudly, "the one I told you about." They greeted me warmly. One of them, a tall man in his 60s, shook my hand. "You must be very proud of your mother." I forced a polite smile. It's certainly been a big moment for our family. Technically, that wasn't a lie, because the inheritance dispute had changed everything. About 30 minutes later, the event officially began. Guests took their seats while the foundation director stepped onto the stage. He welcomed everyone and spoke about the organization's mission. Then he began building anticipation. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate one of the most generous contributions our foundation has ever received." Applause filled the room. My mother sat beside me, glowing with excitement. I noticed her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. The director continued, "This extraordinary gift will allow us to expand youth programs across the region." Another wave of applause. The charity drama was unfolding exactly as planned. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Finally, the director smiled and gestured toward my mother. "Please join me in welcoming the incredible woman behind this life-changing donation." The audience clapped as she stood. She glanced at me briefly before walking toward the stage. For a moment, I wondered if she expected me to stand too, to share the spotlight. But I remained seated, watching quietly. As she stepped behind the microphone, the room fell silent. "My late husband believed deeply in helping others," she began. Her voice sounded warm, emotional, almost convincing. "And I know he would be proud to see his life's work supporting children who need it most." Hearing her say that made my chest tighten, because that's not what my father had wanted. But before she could continue her speech, something unexpected happened. The foundation director walked back onto the stage and leaned toward her. He whispered something. At first, she looked confused, then surprised, then uneasy. The audience began murmuring quietly. The director returned to the microphone. His tone had changed slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said carefully, "it appears there has been a small administrative issue regarding the confirmation of the donation funds." The room grew noticeably quieter. My mother turned toward him, clearly alarmed. "What do you mean?" she whispered. But the microphone picked up her words, and suddenly the entire charity drama began to shift. because the director continued speaking. Our financial team has informed us that the majority of the pledged donation is still tied to restricted investments. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Translation: the money wasn't actually available, not yet, which meant the massive donation at the center of this inheritance dispute had been announced before it truly existed. My mother's face drained of color. "But that's impossible," she said into the microphone. The director gave an apologetic smile. "It simply means we may need to delay the official recognition until the transfer process is completed." Delay. Such a small word, yet in that moment it shattered the entire illusion. The reporters in the room immediately started whispering to each other. Guests looked confused, some even glanced toward me, and suddenly the private family conflict my mother had tried to hide inside a heroic story was unraveling in front of everyone. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because the truth had finally walked onto the stage by itself, and karma had chosen the perfect audience. The silence in the room lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. The kind of silence that spreads slowly as people begin realizing something is wrong. My mother stood frozen behind the microphone. Her speech papers were still in her hand, but she wasn't looking at them anymore. She was staring at the foundation director, confused, embarrassed, and slowly beginning to understand what had just happened. The charity drama she had carefully built over the past few months had just collapsed in front of an entire audience. The director tried to recover quickly. "These things happen sometimes with large financial transfers," he said diplomatically. "We simply need confirmation of the available funds." In other words, the money wasn't there, at least not in the way everyone had been promised. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others looked curious. A few reporters were already typing notes into their phones. Because suddenly the story wasn't about generosity anymore, it was about confusion, about an unexpected inheritance dispute hiding behind a charitable announcement. My mother's voice trembled when she spoke again. "There must be some mistake." The director gave a careful smile. "It simply means we may need to delay the official recognition until the transfer process is completed." Delay. Such a small word, yet in that moment it shattered the entire illusion. And that's when she finally turned to me. We were standing near the exit when she spoke. "Did you know about this?" she asked quietly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. I met her eyes. I knew the funds were still tied to the investment contracts. She stared at me for a long moment. "So you let this happen?" The question hung in the air. I thought carefully before answering. "I didn't let anything happen. I just stopped pretending the inheritance dispute didn't exist." She looked away. For the first time since this entire family conflict began, she didn't argue with herself. She didn't defend herself. She just stood there in silence. And in that moment, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel revenge. What I felt instead was relief, because the truth was finally out. No more pretending, no more carefully staged charity drama, just reality. A few weeks later, the situation was resolved quietly. The foundation postponed the donation indefinitely. After reviewing the documents and my father's original investment plans, the legal advisors recommended restructuring the account properly, this time with clear instructions. My mother and I barely spoke during that process. The family conflict had changed our relationship in ways neither of us could fully undo. But eventually, the money was placed into a trust, not controlled by her, not entirely controlled by me either. Instead, it was structured exactly the way my father had intended, a safety net, a future, and a reminder. Because this whole inheritance dispute taught me something important. Sometimes the people we trust the most make decisions we can't understand.
Sometimes good intentions turn into painful consequences, and sometimes the only way to resolve a conflict is to let the truth speak for itself. My mother and I are still figuring out what our relationship looks like now. It's quieter, more careful, but maybe also more honest. And as strange as it sounds, I don't hate her. People are complicated, families are complicated. Even the worst family conflict can teach you something about boundaries, trust, and forgiveness. Still, I sometimes wonder about that the moment when the entire charity drama unraveled in front of everyone. Not because I wanted to embarrass her, but because it proved something my father always believed. The truth doesn't need revenge, it just needs time. And sometimes I still ask myself one question. If you were in my position, would you have fought the inheritance dispute the same way, or would you have done something completely different?